The morning of the 12th of October dawned crisp and golden over St. Mary Mead, the sort of autumn day that makes even the most hardened villager pause to admire the turning leaves. In the neat gardens behind the high street, chrysanthemums glowed like small suns. In the air carried the faint, comforting smell of wood smoke from cottage fires already lit against the coming chill. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her usual window overlooking the garden, was knitting a soft lavender shawl for young Mrs. Harmon's expected baby. Her needles clicked with quiet, steady rhythm, while her sharp blue eyes occasionally lifted to watch the quiet comings and goings of the village. She had lived here long enough to know that peace was often only a delicate surface, like the thin skin on a bowl of milk. At precisely 10 minutes past 9, now the first ripple appeared. Mrs. Martha Price, the daily help at Old Priory House, came hurrying down the lane with her coat flapping open and her round, good-natured face unusually pale. She stopped at the vicarage gate, spoke rapidly to the vicar's wife, and then hurried on toward the police station. Within minutes, the news had begun to spread through the village like smoke from a faulty chimney. Colonel Lucius Abercrombie was dead. Old Priory House stood a little apart from the main village, a handsome Georgian building of warm red brick, half hidden behind ancient yew hedges. Colonel Abercrombie, a wealthy retired officer who had made his fortune in rubber plantations in Malaya, had lived there alone for the past 12 years, ever since his wife's death. He was known as a recluse, courteous enough when spoken to, but rarely inviting conversation. His household consisted of his efficient housekeeper, Mrs. Price, a young gardener named Tom Briggs, and a rather nervous parlour maid called Edith. It was Mrs. Price who had found him. She had taken the colonel his morning tea at exactly 9 o'clock, as she did every day without fail. The tray carried his favourite Darjeeling, 2 slices of thinly buttered toast, and a small pot of marmalade. She had knocked, received the usual gruff, "Come," and entered the study. The colonel was seated at his large mahogany desk in his favourite worn leather chair, dressed in his old dressing gown, exactly as she had left him the night before when she brought his bedtime cocoa. Only this time he did not look up. His head had fallen forward onto an open ledger, so his right hand still rested on the fountain pen he had been using. The tea she had brought 10 minutes earlier sat untouched on the corner of the desk, the liquid now cold and faintly filmed. Mrs. Price had screamed. Once, sharply, then run for help. By the time Dr. Haydock arrived, the study door was still locked from the inside. The only key was found in the colonel's dressing gown pocket. The windows were fastened securely, and there were no signs of disturbance. The elderly doctor had examined the body carefully, noted the bluish tinge to the lips and the peaceful, almost surprised expression on the colonel's weathered face, and pronounced the cause of death as likely poisoning, though he would not commit himself until after the post-mortem. Inspector Slack of the county police was summoned. He was a brisk, a rather self-important man who had never quite warmed to Miss Marple's gentle methods, though he had learned, somewhat grudgingly, to respect her results. Miss Marple herself heard the full story from her faithful friend, Dolly Bantry, who arrived at the cottage shortly before 11, breathless and wide-eyed with the delicious horror of it all. "Jane, my dear, it's simply extraordinary," said Mrs. Bantry, sinking into the chintz-covered armchair and accepting a cup of coffee. "Locked room, key in his pocket, no one heard a thing. And yet the doctor says he died no more than 10 or 15 minutes after Martha took him his tea. 10 minutes, Jane. How on earth does a man get murdered in 10 minutes when nobody was in the room with him?" Miss Marple's needles paused for a moment. "Come, people so often notice everything except the one thing that matters," she murmured. "Tell me, Dolly, who exactly was in the house this morning?" Mrs. Bantry ticked them off on her fingers. Martha Price was in the kitchen preparing breakfast for the staff after taking the tray up. Tom Briggs was in the garden, clipping the hedges near the study window. He says he saw nothing. Edith, the parlour maid, was upstairs making the beds, and there was one other person, Colonel Abercrombie's nephew, Mr. Raymond West. "No, wait, not your Raymond, Jane. This is a different one. Gerald Abercrombie. He arrived from London yesterday evening for a short visit. Rather a handsome young man, I'm told, though a bit too smooth for my taste. Miss Marple smiled faintly at the mention of her own nephew's name, but her eyes remained thoughtful. And the Colonel had no other visitors? None that anyone knows of. He was a very private man, kept to his routines. Breakfast at 8:30 in the dining room, tea in the study at 9, then he would work on his accounts until lunch. Very methodical, Martha says. Miss Marple laid her knitting aside and gazed out at her garden, where a blackbird was busily turning over leaves in search of worms. 10 minutes, she said softly. Such a very short time. And yet, my dear Dolly, in 10 minutes a great many things can happen, or fail to happen. By early afternoon the village was humming. Small groups gathered outside the post office and the Blue Boar. Speculation ran wild. Some said the Colonel had taken his own life. Others whispered about a secret enemy from his Malayan days. A few even suggested that the new gardener, Tom Briggs, had been stealing roses and had been caught. Miss Marple, however, did not join the gossip. Instead, she put on her best hat, the one with the small bunch of violets, and walked slowly up to Old Priory House under the pretext of offering her condolences to the household. Mrs. Price, red-eyed and still shaken, let her in. The housekeeper was a sensible, middle-aged woman who had served the Colonel faithfully for 8 years. "It was such a shock, Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He was sitting there just as usual. I thought at first he'd nodded off, but when I touched his shoulder, oh, it was awful. His face was so still." Miss Marple patted her arm gently. "You must have been very fond of him, my dear." Mrs. Price hesitated, then gave a small, sad smile. "He could be difficult, but he was fair. Paid good wages. One never raised his voice unless provoked. And he loved this house. Said it reminded him of the old days in England before he went abroad." They were standing in the wide hallway when a young man came down the stairs. He was tall, fair-haired, with the easy confidence of someone used to good tailoring and good schools. Gerald Abercrombie. "Mrs. Price, is there any news from the police?" he asked. His voice was pleasant, but there was a slight edge of impatience beneath the politeness. "Not yet, sir. Dr. Haydock said he'd ring as soon as the post-mortem is done." Gerald's eyes flicked to Miss Marple. "And you are?" "Miss Jane Marple," she said with her sweetest smile. "A neighbor. I came to see if there was anything I could do. These things are so distressing, especially when they happen so suddenly." Gerald inclined his head. "Very kind of you. My uncle was not a man who made many friends, I'm afraid. Still, the circumstances are peculiar." "Indeed they are," said Miss Marple mildly. "A locked room, a man dead at his desk, and only 10 minutes between his housekeeper leaving the room and her return. One does wonder what could possibly have occurred in so short a time." There was the briefest flicker in Gerald's eyes, something that might have been surprise, or perhaps annoyance. "Yes," he said, "one does wonder." Miss Marple took her leave shortly afterwards, but not before she had noticed several small details. The faint scent of expensive Turkish cigarettes in the hallway, the fact that Gerald's shoes were freshly polished, though he claimed to have been reading in his room all morning, and the way Mrs. Price's hands trembled when she mentioned the untouched tea tray. As she walked home through the golden afternoon light, Miss Marple's mind was busy. 10 minutes. Such a very ordinary length of time, long enough to drink a cup of tea, long enough to write a short note. Long enough, perhaps, for someone to slip into a room, do what needed to be done, and slip out again, leaving behind only the quiet rhythm of everyday life. But who and how? She paused by the churchyard gate and looked back at the chimneys of Old Priory House rising above the yews. "People see what they expect to see," she murmured to herself, "and they notice everything, except the one thing that is out of place." The first faint shadow of suspicion had begun to form in Miss Marple's mind. But it was still only a shadow, delicate as the autumn mist that was now beginning to gather in the hollows of the fields. She had 10 minutes to understand, and she intended to use them well. That same afternoon, Miss Marple accepted an invitation to tea at Old Priory House. It was not her usual custom to intrude upon a house of mourning so soon, but Mrs. Price had seemed genuinely grateful for the offer of quiet company, and Miss Marple had learned long ago that grief often loosened tongues more effectively than any official questioning. The drawing-room was large and rather somber, furnished in the heavy style of 30 years earlier. Dark oak paneling, velvet curtains, and a Persian carpet that had seen better days. A fire had been lit against the growing chill, and its light danced across the faces of those gathered there. Mrs. Price poured tea with hands that were steadier now, though her eyes remained red-rimmed. Beside her sat Edith, the young parlour-maid, a thin, nervous girl of 22 with fair hair, pinned tightly back, and a habit of twisting her apron when she thought no one was looking. Tom Briggs, the gardener, stood awkwardly near the window, cap in hand, clearly uncomfortable in his Sunday suit. And at the head of the small circle sat Gerald Abercrombie, looking every inch the concerned nephew, though Miss Marple noticed that his mourning armband had been rather hastily pinned on. "I still can't believe it," Mrs. Price said quietly as she passed a plate of seed cake. "He was so particular about his routines. Tea at 9 sharp, always the same. And to think that 10 minutes later, her voice trailed off." Edith gave a small, involuntary sob and quickly covered it with a cough. Miss Marple took a sip of tea. Excellent Darjeeling, the same blend the Colonel had favoured, and spoke in her gentlest voice. "These sudden deaths are always a shock, my dear, especially when the deceased was so methodical. One feels that if only one had noticed something amiss, perhaps it could have been prevented." Gerald leaned forward slightly. "Did you know my uncle well, Miss Marple?" "Not well, Mr. Abercrombie. We exchanged pleasantries at church fetes and the occasional village meeting. He kept very much to himself, but one hears things, you know. In a small place like St. Mary Mead, people notice habits." Tom Briggs cleared his throat. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but the Colonel was a fair employer. Paid on time, never grudged a man a day off if the work was done. I was out by the study window this morning, clipping the yew. Didn't hear a thing, not a cry, not a groan. Just the usual bird song and the sound of my shears." Miss Marple turned her mild blue eyes upon him. "And you saw nothing unusual through the window, Mr. Briggs?" The young gardener shifted his weight. The curtains were half drawn, as they always were in the mornings. I could see the Colonel's desk, but only his shoulder and the side of his head. He looked like he was writing, same as always. I waved once when I passed, but he didn't look up. Thought nothing of it. Edith spoke suddenly, her voice high and thin. "I was upstairs making the beds, miss. I heard Mrs. Price scream, but before that, nothing. The Colonel liked quiet in the mornings, said it helped him think." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "And you, Mr. Abercrombie? You arrived only yesterday evening, I understand." Gerald smiled, a charming, easy smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "That's right. Uncle Lucius wired me on Monday asking me to come down. Said he wanted to discuss family matters. I took the last train from Paddington and arrived just after 8. We had a late supper together, cold beef and pickles. He seemed in his usual health, a little tired perhaps, but nothing more. We spoke of my work in the city, my mother's health, ordinary things. He retired to his study around 10:30, and I went to my room. I read for a while and slept soundly. Knew nothing until Martha woke the whole house with her screaming this morning." There was a short silence. The fire crackled. Outside, a gust of wind sent a shower of yellow leaves against the window panes. Miss Marple set down her cup. "Family matters," she repeated softly. "How very interesting. One does wonder what could have been so urgent after all these years of rather distant relations." Gerald's expression tightened for the briefest moment. My uncle was not a demonstrative man, Miss Marple. But blood is blood. I was his only living relative apart from a distant cousin in Canada. Naturally, he wished to see me. Naturally, Miss Marple agreed, her voice as mild as milk. But her mind was busy noting the slight flush that had risen on Gerald's smooth cheeks and the way his fingers drummed once, lightly, on the arm of his chair. Mrs. Price offered more cake, which everyone refused politely. The conversation turned to practical matters, the arrangements for the funeral, the reading of the will, the necessity of informing the Colonel's solicitor in London. And Miss Marple listened quietly, her knitting needles, which she had brought along in her large handbag, clicking softly in her lap. She had found, over the years, that the simple act of knitting often encouraged others to speak more freely, as though her attention was safely occupied elsewhere. It was Edith who finally broke the surface tension. "He was writing in his ledger when I took his cocoa last night," the girl said suddenly. "I saw the book open on the desk. He looked up and said, 'Thank you, Edith. That will be all.' Very polite, he was. Not like some gentlemen who don't even notice you're there." Miss Marple's needles paused. "A ledger, you say? Business accounts?" "I think so, miss. He was always fussing over his investments. Said the market was tricky these days." Gerald gave a small laugh. Uncle Lucius trusted no one with his money. Kept every penny accounted for himself. I offered to help him once with modern bookkeeping methods, but he wouldn't hear of it." Miss Marple smiled. Older gentlemen often prefer their own ways. So comforting, isn't it? The familiar routine. She stayed another 20 minutes, speaking gently of village affairs and offering what small comforts she could. When she rose to leave, Mrs. Price walked her to the door. "You've been very kind, Miss Marple," the housekeeper said quietly. "It helps having someone steady about. The police were here earlier, Inspector Slack. He asked so many questions, all sharp and quick, made poor Edith cry." Miss Marple patted her hand. "The inspector means well, my dear, but sometimes the gentle approach reveals more. Tell me, had the Colonel seemed worried lately? Any change in his habits?" Mrs. Price hesitated, glancing back toward the drawing room. "Not exactly worried, but thoughtful. He spent more time in his study these past 2 weeks. And yesterday, after Mr. Gerald arrived, they talked late. I heard raised voices once, but only for a moment. Then it was quiet again." "Raised voices," Miss Marple repeated. "How very human. Families so often have things to say that cannot be said lightly." She walked home slowly, the autumn air cool against her cheeks. The sun was already low, painting the church tower in warm gold. As she passed the vicarage, she saw Inspector Slack's car parked outside. No doubt he was questioning the vicar and his wife about the Colonel's character. Miss Marple's thoughts turned inward. 10 minutes. In 10 minutes, a man could drink poisoned tea, or he could be given something else entirely. A letter, a threat, a promise, a moment of rage or fear that changed everything. She thought of Gerald Abercrombie's polished smile, of Tom Briggs' honest, work-roughened hands, of Edith's nervous twisting of her apron, and of Mrs. Price's quiet loyalty. Somewhere in that house, someone knew exactly what had happened in those 10 crucial minutes. Someone who had moved through the ordinary rhythm of the morning as though nothing were amiss, pouring tea, clipping hedges, making beds, greeting a nephew. Miss Marple reached her own cottage gate and paused, looking back toward Old Priory House, now half hidden in the lengthening shadows. "The devil is in the details," she murmured, "and the details are so very small, yet so very telling." She went inside, lit the lamp, and then sat down at her writing desk. There were letters to write, questions to consider, and above all, the quiet, patient work of observation. Because in St. Mary Mead, as in life, the truth was rarely dramatic. It was hidden in the small things people noticed every day. and in the one thing they had failed to notice in those fatal 10 minutes. The following morning brought a fine, misty rain that softened the edges of St. Mary Mead and made the cobbled lanes gleam like polished pewter. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and after a light breakfast of toast and marmalade, she made her way to the vicarage. The Reverend Leonard Clement and his wife Griselda were old friends, and she knew that if anyone in the village had heard whispers worth listening to, it would be through the gentle network of parish life. Griselda, young, pretty, and delightfully irreverent, greeted her with a warm hug and a cup of strong coffee. "Jane, you angel. I was hoping you'd come. The whole village is buzzing like a hive. Poor Colonel Abercrombie. Who would have thought such a quiet man could cause so much excitement in death?" The vicar joined them in the cozy study, looking rather harassed. "It's most distressing," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "Inspector Slack was here again yesterday evening. He seems convinced it was suicide, but the locked door and the key in the pocket make it all very puzzling. He asked me about the Colonel's spiritual state, whether he had shown any signs of melancholy. I told him the Colonel attended church regularly enough, but he was never one for confidences." Miss Marple stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "And what did you make of the nephew, Mr. Gerald Abercrombie? He seems a capable young man." Griselda gave a small laugh. "Capable and rather too charming, if you ask me. He came to see Leonard yesterday afternoon. Very polite, very concerned, but there was something calculated about it, as though he were playing a part he had rehearsed." The vicar nodded. "He spoke of his uncle with proper respect, but I sensed a certain relief beneath it. The Colonel was not an easy man to please, apparently. There had been disagreements over money in the past. Gerald's mother, Lucius's sister, had borrowed rather heavily from him some years ago, and the debt was never fully settled." Miss Marple's blue eyes sharpened. "Money. How often it lies at the root of these sad affairs. Did the Colonel ever speak of changing his will?" "Not to me," said the vicar. "But then, he was a very private person, and he did mention once that he found modern young people rather careless with inheritance. Too much expectation and too little gratitude," he said. Outside, the rain pattered softly against the window. Miss Marple gazed at the drops running down the glass and thought of the untouched tea tray in the Colonel's study. 10 minutes. Time enough for a man to sip his tea and feel the first warning signs. Time enough for someone to watch and wait. Later that morning, Miss Marple paid a call on Dr. Haydock at his surgery. The doctor was an old friend, blunt and kind-hearted, and he had long since given up trying to keep secrets from her gentle persistence. "Well, Jane," he said, closing the door behind her, "I suppose you've come for the post-mortem details. Officially, I shouldn't say a word, but unofficially, it was poison. Digitalis. Quite a large dose, administered in liquid form. It would have acted quickly. Palpitations, dizziness, collapse. Death within 10 to 15 minutes. The tea itself was clean, by the way. No trace in the cup or pot." Miss Marple sat very still. "Digitalis. How very domestic. It grows in so many gardens, doesn't it?" "Exactly. Easy enough to obtain if one knows what one is doing. But here's the curious part. There were no signs of struggle. No overturned chair, no broken cup. The Colonel was sitting peacefully at his desk, pen in hand, as though he had simply nodded off while writing. The ledger was open before him, and he had written a single line after Mrs. Price left the room. 10 minutes to decide." Miss Marple drew in a soft breath. 10 minutes to decide. How very significant. And the handwriting. Steady. Perfectly steady. And no tremor, which suggests he wrote it before the poison took full effect. He must have known something was wrong almost immediately. Miss Marple's mind worked rapidly. So he drank something else, or the poison was introduced in another way. Dr. Haydock shrugged. "That's for Inspector Slack to discover. The only other item on the desk was a small glass of water, half empty. but the water was pure. No poison there either. Miss Marple thanked the doctor and walked home through the drizzle, her umbrella held high. The words, 10 minutes to decide, echoed in her thoughts. Decide what? His will, his suspicions, his own fate. That afternoon, the rain cleared and a pale sun broke through. Miss Marple decided to take a turn in the garden of Old Priory House. She found Tom Briggs trimming the rose beds, his strong hands moving with quiet competence. "Good afternoon, Mr. Briggs," she said pleasantly. "Such a sad business. You must feel it keenly, working so close to the house." Tom straightened up, wiping his forehead with the back of his sleeve. I do, miss. The Colonel was a hard man, but just. He liked his garden kept neat. Said it reminded him of order in a chaotic world. I was right here yesterday morning, not 20 yards from the study window. The curtains were drawn halfway, like always. I saw him at his desk. He lifted his hand once, as if waving or pointing at something, but he didn't call out. Then I moved round to the side border and didn't see him again until Mrs. Price started screaming. Miss Marple nodded. "And did you notice anyone else near the study during that time?" Tom hesitated. "Only Mr. Gerald. And he came out into the garden for a smoke about 9:10. Stood on the terrace for a minute or two, looking at the house. Then he went back inside. Seemed restless like." "Restless," Miss Marple repeated. "How very natural, under the circumstances. A young man suddenly faced with his uncle's death." She left Tom to his work and wandered toward the terrace. From there, the study window was clearly visible, though the lower half was obscured by the yew hedge. A person standing on the terrace could see the Colonel's head and shoulders if the curtains were not fully drawn. She was still standing there when Gerald Abercrombie came out of the house. He looked surprised to see her, but recovered his charming smile quickly. "Miss Marple, taking the air?" "Indeed, gardens are such a comfort in times of sorrow, aren't they? They go on with their quiet work no matter what happens to us." Gerald lit a cigarette and exhaled slowly. "My uncle loved this garden. Spent hours planning it when he first returned from Malaya. Said it was his way of putting down roots again. He was planning to leave the house to me, you know. Or at least that's what he hinted last night." Miss Marple's expression remained serene. "How generous! And did he mention any other bequests?" Gerald's eyes narrowed slightly. "A few small legacies. To Mrs. Price for her long service. Something for the gardener. But the bulk of the estate. Yes, he spoke of leaving it to family. Blood is thicker than water," he said. There was a faint edge to his voice now, a hint of defensiveness. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Blood can be a complicated thing, Mr. Abercrombie, and it carries both love and old resentments. Your uncle must have felt the weight of many years when he sat down to write that last line." Gerald stiffened. "What last line?" "In his ledger. 10 minutes to decide. Dr. Haydock mentioned it. Rather cryptic, don't you think?" For a moment, Gerald's polished mask slipped. A flash of something, anger, fear, crossed his face. Then he laughed, a short, forced sound. Uncle Lucius was always dramatic in his own quiet way, probably deciding whether to sell some shares or change his investments. He was obsessed with his accounts. "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, "or perhaps he was deciding something far more personal, something that concerned the people closest to him." She left Gerald standing on the terrace, his cigarette burning forgotten between his fingers. As she walked back through the garden, she noticed Edith watching from an upper window, her face pale and anxious. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her own fireside, knitting steadily. The lavender shawl was growing, row by careful row, but her thoughts were far from woolen needles. 10 minutes. Time enough for a man to write a single telling sentence. Time enough for poison to begin its silent work. Time enough for someone in the house to slip into the study, speak a few urgent words, administer the fatal dose. perhaps in a glass of water offered with a concerned hand, and then leave again, bolting the door from the inside with the key that would later be found in the dead man's pocket. But how? The method still eluded her. The human heart, however, did not. She had seen the tremor in Mrs. Price's hands, the nervousness in Edith's eyes, the restless energy in Tom Briggs, and the carefully controlled ambition in Gerald Abercrombie. Somewhere among these ordinary, flawed, feeling human beings lay the truth. Hidden not in dramatic shadows, but in the small everyday rhythms that everyone had noticed, except for those crucial 10 minutes when no one had truly looked. Miss Marple put down her knitting and stared into the fire. "The answer is there," she whispered, "in the things people expect to see, and in the one small thing they did not." The inquest was held on Friday morning in the village hall, a plain, drafty building that smelled faintly of floor polish and old hymn books. The coroner, a fussy little man from Much Benham, conducted proceedings with brisk efficiency, but the atmosphere remained heavy with unspoken questions. Mrs. Price gave evidence first, her voice steady, but her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She described taking the tea tray to the study at 9 o'clock precisely. The colonel had thanked her as usual. She had noticed nothing amiss. When she returned 10 minutes later with the Morning Post, she found him slumped at his desk. The door had been locked from the inside, the key in his dressing-gown pocket. No, she had not touched anything except his shoulder to rouse him. Inspector Slack followed, confirming the locked-room nature of the death and the preliminary findings of digitalis poisoning. The jury returned a verdict of murder by person or persons unknown, which caused a ripple of whispers through the crowded hall. Miss Marple sat quietly near the back, her knitting in her lap, observing the faces around her. The Gerald Abercrombie looked suitably grave in a well-cut dark suit. Tom Briggs shifted uncomfortably in his seat, as though the formal setting made him feel exposed. Edith kept dabbing her eyes with a small handkerchief, her thin shoulders trembling. After the inquest, small groups lingered outside. Miss Marple approached Mrs. Price, who was standing a little apart, looking pale and exhausted. "My dear, you held up very well," Miss Marple said gently. "It must have been a terrible ordeal for you." The housekeeper gave a weary smile. "I keep thinking about those 10 minutes, Miss Marple. I was in the kitchen the whole time, washing up the breakfast things. I heard nothing. If only I'd gone back sooner." "You must not blame yourself," Miss Marple replied. "None of us can see into the future. But tell me, had the colonel seemed anxious about anything in the days leading up to his death? Any visitors? Any letters that upset him?" Mrs. Price hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was listening too closely. "There was one letter last week, from a firm of solicitors in London. He read it in the study and then burned it in the fireplace. I saw the ashes when I cleared the grate. He seemed preoccupied afterwards, and Mr. Gerald's arrival seemed to make things worse. They argued that first evening, not loudly, but I could hear the tension through the door. Something about past mistakes and blood money." "Blood money," Miss Marple repeated softly. "A very strong phrase. Families do carry old wounds, don't they?" She left Mrs. Price and made her way to the Blue Boar, where she knew she could find a quiet corner for tea. The landlord's wife, Mrs. Dooley, brought her a pot and a plate of fresh scones, clearly eager for conversation. "Terrible business, isn't it, Miss Marple? A man murdered in his own locked study. Makes you wonder who could have done it. That nephew of his looks a bit too smooth, if you ask me." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "Appearances can be deceptive, Mrs. Dooley. Mr. Gerald seems genuinely distressed. Distressed or not, he stands to inherit a tidy sum from what I hear. The colonel was worth a pretty penny. Rubber plantations, investments, the house, all going to the nephew unless the will says otherwise." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. Money. Always money. Yet something about the phrase 10 minutes to decide suggested a more personal crisis, a decision that had cost the colonel his life. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call on Tom Briggs at his small cottage behind the church. The young gardener was sitting on a bench outside, mending a pair of pruning shears. He looked up in surprise when she approached. "Miss Marple, didn't expect to see you here." "I was passing," she said pleasantly, "and thought I might ask you a small favor. My own rose beds are in need of attention, but first I wanted to ask you about the morning of the colonel's death. You were working near the study window. Did you happen to notice the time when Mr. Gerald came out onto the terrace?" Tom set the shears aside. "Must have been about 9:10. I remember because the church clock struck the quarter just after he went back inside. He stood there smoking, looking up at the study window. Seemed deep in thought. Then he flicked the cigarette away and went in through the side door." Miss Marple nodded. "And did you see anyone else near the house during that time?" "No, miss. Just the usual. Edith came out to shake a duster from an upstairs window around 9:15, but that was after Mrs. Price had screamed. The only strange thing was the colonel's hand. I saw him raise it once, as if he was pointing or waving at someone inside the room, but the curtains were drawn halfway so I couldn't see clearly." "A hand raised," Miss Marple murmured. "How very interesting. Almost as if he were trying to signal or protest." Tom shrugged. "Could have been anything. He was writing when I first saw him. Maybe he was just stretching." Miss Marple thanked him and walked slowly back to her cottage. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, though still faint and incomplete. Gerald on the terrace at 9:10, the colonel raising his hand, the locked door, the key in the pocket, the single line in the ledger, 10 minutes to decide. That evening, Miss Marple invited her old friend Dolly Bantry to supper. Over a simple meal of cold ham, salad, and baked apples, she shared what she had learned. Dolly listened with bright eyes. "It sounds like a classic locked-room puzzle, Jane, but with real people and real feelings. Do you think Gerald slipped in and poisoned his uncle while Mrs. Price was in the kitchen?" "It is possible," Miss Marple said. "But the timing is very tight. 10 minutes is not long to enter a room, administer poison, lock the door from the inside, and leave again without being seen. And then why would the colonel write 10 minutes to decide if he was already being poisoned?" "Perhaps the poison was already in him," Dolly suggested. "Or perhaps someone gave him something earlier." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No, Dr. Haydock was quite clear. The dose acted quickly. It had to have been given shortly after 9 o'clock. She paused, her knitting needles clicking steadily. "There is one thing that troubles me, Dolly. The human touch. The colonel was not a man who made enemies easily. He was reclusive, yes, but fair. Yet someone in that house felt driven to end his life in such a cold, calculated way. That suggests a deep, personal motive, something hidden beneath the ordinary routines of the household." Dolly leaned forward. "And you think you know who?" "Not yet," Miss Marple replied. "But I am beginning to see the shape of it. People reveal themselves in small ways, a nervous glance, a trembling hand, a forced smile. The murderer is someone who walked through those 10 minutes as though nothing had happened, someone who continued with their daily tasks while a man lay dying at his desk. That takes a certain kind of coldness, or a very great desperation." The fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, the village lay quiet under a clear, starlit sky. In the distance, the chimneys of Old Priory House rose dark against the night. Miss Marple looked into the flames and saw not the burning logs, but the faces of the people involved. Mrs. Price's loyal weariness, Edith's frightened eyes, Tom Briggs' honest confusion, and Gerald Abercrombie's carefully controlled charm. One of them had crossed a line in those 10 minutes. Then one of them had chosen death over whatever decision the colonel had been weighing. And Miss Marple, with her gentle wisdom and sharp observation, was determined to discover which ordinary human failing had turned into murder. The weekend passed quietly in St. Mary Mead, but beneath the surface the village simmered with speculation. Sunday morning service at the church was unusually well attended, and more than one head turned when Gerald Abercrombie entered and took a seat near the front. He sang the hymns with proper reverence and listened attentively to the vicar's sermon on forgiveness. Yet Miss Marple, watching from her usual pew, noted the slight tension in his shoulders, and the way his eyes occasionally drifted toward the stained glass window, as though his thoughts were far away. After the service, she found herself walking beside him down the church path. The autumn leaves crunched softly under their feet. "A beautiful sermon, wasn't it?" she said mildly. "Mr. Clement always speaks so wisely about the burdens we carry." Gerald gave a small nod. "Yes, though some burdens are heavier than others, Miss Marple. My uncle's death has left many questions unanswered. The police still have no clear suspect, and the locked room makes everything seem impossible. Impossible things often have the simplest explanations once one looks at them from the right angle," Miss Marple replied. "Tell me, Mr. Abercrombie, did your uncle ever speak to you about his intentions regarding the will? You mentioned he hinted at leaving you the house." Gerald hesitated, then answered carefully. "He did, on the night I arrived, after supper. And he said he had been thinking about the future and wanted family to carry on after him. He spoke of old regrets, things that happened years ago in Malaya. He mentioned a business partner who had died under suspicious circumstances. Said he had always felt partly responsible, though he swore he had done nothing wrong. It weighed on him." Miss Marple's blue eyes were gentle but sharp. "Guilt can be a terrible companion, especially in old age. Did he seem afraid of anything? Or anyone?" "Not afraid exactly, but restless. He kept looking at the clock that evening as though time were running out. When I asked if something was wrong, he only said, 10 minutes can change everything, my boy. Remember that." Then he changed the subject. 10 minutes, Miss Marple repeated softly. How often those words keep returning, and almost as if they were a warning or a confession. They had reached the lich gate. Gerald stopped and turned to her, his handsome face suddenly serious. "Miss Marple, I know what people are saying, that I stand to gain the most from my uncle's death, but I swear to you I had nothing to do with it. I admired him in my own way. He was difficult, yes, but he built something from nothing. I wanted his respect, not his fortune through such means." There was a ring of sincerity in his voice, mixed with genuine distress. Miss Marple patted his arm lightly. "We none of us know what we are capable of until the moment comes, my dear. But I believe you when you say you did not wish him harm. Still, secrets have a way of coming to light in small villages like this, and perhaps it would help if you told the police everything you know." Gerald's mouth tightened. "I have told them everything. There is nothing more." He bade her goodbye rather abruptly and walked away toward Old Priory House. Miss Marple watched him go, her expression thoughtful. Young men in trouble often spoke with passion, but passion could hide many things. Fear, ambition, even love turned sour. That afternoon she called again at Old Priory House, this time asking specifically to speak with Edith in the kitchen. Mrs. Price was out doing the marketing, so the young parlour-maid was alone, polishing silver with nervous energy. Edith looked up with frightened eyes when Miss Marple entered. "Oh, miss, I didn't expect visitors. Mrs. Price isn't here." "That's quite all right, my dear. I only wanted a quiet word with you. You seem so upset since that terrible morning. It must have been a great shock." Edith's hands trembled as she set down the polishing cloth. "It was awful, miss. I keep seeing his face in my dreams. Peaceful, like he was sleeping, but I know he wasn't. Someone killed him, and I was right there in the house." Miss Marple sat down at the kitchen table and spoke gently. "You were upstairs making beds, I understand. Did you hear anything unusual between 9 and 9:15? Any voices? Any movement on the stairs?" The girl bit her lip. Nothing loud, but I did hear Mr. Gerald come up the back stairs around 9:10. He was breathing hard like he'd been running. He went into his room and closed the door quickly. I thought maybe he was upset about something his uncle said. They'd been talking in the study the night before. Eyes and voices were raised. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. Raised voices can mean many things: anger, fear, even love. Did you notice anything else? Anything at all that seemed out of place? Edith hesitated, then whispered. There was one thing. When I went to shake the duster from the landing window, I saw Tom Briggs near the study. He was looking in through a gap in the curtains. He had a strange look on his face, sort of angry and sad at the same time. Then he moved away quickly when Mrs. Price screamed. Tom Briggs, Miss Marple murmured. The gardener, a steady young man, or so everyone says, but even steady people can be driven to desperate acts if they feel wronged. She stayed a few minutes longer, speaking kindly to Edith about her future and offering what comfort she could. As she left the house, she paused by the study window from the outside. The curtains were now fully drawn, but she could imagine the scene on that fatal morning. The Colonel at his desk, the untouched tea tray, the open ledger with its cryptic line. She found Tom Briggs working in the kitchen garden, digging up potatoes with steady, rhythmic movements. He straightened when he saw her, wiping his hands on his trousers. Miss Marple? Something I can do for you? Only a small question, Mr. Briggs. On the morning of the Colonel's death, Edith says she saw you looking into the study window. You mentioned earlier that you saw the Colonel raise his hand. Was there anyone else in the room with him at that moment? Tom's face darkened. I don't like being spied on, miss. But since you ask. No, I didn't see anyone else. The Colonel was alone. He looked up suddenly. He raised his hand, as if waving someone away or pointing at something. Then he bent over his ledger again. I moved on because I had work to do. Didn't think anything of it until later. Miss Marple studied his honest, weathered face. You were fond of the Colonel, weren't you? He was fair to me. Gave me a chance when no one else would. I had a bit of trouble in my past. Nothing serious, just a foolish fight when I was younger. The Colonel knew about it but still hired me. Said a man deserved a second chance. There was real emotion in Tom's voice, gratitude mixed with grief. Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy. Human hearts were so complicated. Loyalty, resentment, love and fear could twist together until one small act became tragedy. As she walked home through the lengthening shadows, Miss Marple's mind turned over the new pieces, and Gerald on the back stairs, breathing hard, Tom looking in at the window with an angry, sad expression, the Colonel raising his hand as if in protest or farewell, and always those haunting words, 10 minutes to decide. She stopped by the churchyard and sat for a moment on a bench, watching the rooks circling the tower. Life in St. Mary Mead went on, children playing, women gossiping at the post office, men discussing the harvest. Yet in one house, a man had died because someone could not wait those 10 minutes or could not bear what the Colonel had decided in them. That evening, Inspector Slack called at her cottage, looking tired and frustrated. Miss Marple, I hear you've been asking questions again. I'd appreciate it if you left the investigating to the police. Miss Marple offered him tea and a slice of seed cake. Of course, our inspector. But sometimes an old woman sees things that busy gentlemen might overlook. Tell me, have you found any trace of digitalis in the garden or the house? Slack sighed. There are foxgloves in the border, but plenty of houses have them. No direct evidence linking anyone. The will leaves the bulk to Gerald Abercrombie, with generous legacies to Mrs. Price and Briggs. Motive enough for several people, but no proof. Miss Marple smiled gently. Proof is often found in the heart, Inspector, in the small human failings we all try to hide. I believe the answer lies in those 10 minutes when someone acted while everyone else continued with the ordinary business of the day. Slack left looking unconvinced, but Miss Marple remained by her fire, knitting steadily. The pattern was becoming clearer. A decision had been made in that study, and a decision that someone had been desperate to prevent or to force. And in the quiet rhythm of village life, the murderer had hidden in plain sight, counting on those 10 minutes to remain unnoticed forever. Monday brought a sharp frost that silvered the grass and made the yew hedges at Old Priory House stand out dark and solemn against the pale sky. Miss Marple rose early, wrapped herself in a warm shawl, and set out for a walk that was not entirely aimless. She had decided it was time to look more closely at the physical possibilities of those fateful 10 minutes. She arrived at the house just as Mrs. Price was taking in the milk. The housekeeper looked tired, with new lines of worry around her eyes. "Miss Marple, you're out early. Is everything all right?" "Quite all right, my dear. I was hoping I might have another look at the study, if it wouldn't be too much trouble. Sometimes seeing a place again helps one understand what really happened." Mrs. Price hesitated only a moment before leading her inside. The study was exactly as it had been left, except that the body had been removed and the desk tidied slightly by the police. The large mahogany desk still stood in its place by the window. The leather chair was pushed back a little. On the blotter lay the open ledger, now covered with a sheet of protective paper. Miss Marple asked permission to lift it. There, in the Colonel's firm, slightly old-fashioned hand, were the last words he had written, 10 minutes to decide. Below it, the page was blank, as though whatever decision he had been weighing had been interrupted forever. Miss Marple studied the room carefully. The door was heavy oak. It was with a solid bolt on the inside. The key, a large, old-fashioned one, had been found in the Colonel's dressing-gown pocket. The windows were sash-style, fastened with catches that showed no sign of having been forced. A small side table held the remains of the tea tray, now empty, the cup and pot taken away for analysis. She walked to the window and looked out. From here, one could see the terrace and part of the garden where Tom Briggs had been working. The yew hedge was neatly clipped, but there was a narrow gap where branches had been recently trimmed. "Mrs. Price," Miss Marple said gently, "on that morning when you brought the tea, did the Colonel say anything unusual? Any remark at all?" The housekeeper thought hard. "Only the usual. Thank you, Martha." He was already at his desk, writing, and he looked up briefly when I set the tray down. His face was thoughtful, as though he had something important on his mind. Miss Marple nodded. "And when you returned 10 minutes later?" "I knocked, as always. There was no answer. I tried the door. It was locked. I called out, then used my master key to open it from the outside. The bolt had not been shot, only the lock was turned. That's when I saw him." Miss Marple's eyes brightened with quiet interest. "The bolt was not shot?" "That is very important, my dear. So the door was locked with the key but not bolted from inside?" "Yes." The police made a note of it. Miss Marple moved to the door and examined the lock. It was an old mechanism, the kind that could be turned from either side with the proper key, but the key had been found inside the room in the Colonel's pocket. Now she turned to Mrs. Price with a gentle smile. "You have been very patient with an old woman's curiosity. One more question, if I may. Did anyone else in the house have a key to this room?" "Only the Colonel and myself. He kept his on his person or in the desk drawer at night. I have the spare on my ring." Miss Marple thanked her and left the study, her mind turning over this new detail. The door had been locked, the key inside with the victim, yet the bolt had not been drawn. That suggested the murderer had not needed to bolt the door, perhaps because they had left by another way, or because the locking had been done after the act in a way that was meant to confuse. She found Gerald in the morning room, going through some of his uncle's papers. He looked up with a mixture of politeness and wariness. "Miss Marple, have you discovered anything new?" "Only small things, Mr. Abercrombie. Small things that sometimes prove important. Tell me, when you went out onto the terrace that morning for a smoke, did you look toward the study window?" Gerald set down the papers. I did glance up. The curtains were half drawn as usual. I could see my uncle's head and shoulders. He seemed to be writing. I thought he was busy and didn't want to disturb him, so I finished my cigarette and came back inside through the side door. "And did you go up the back stairs immediately after?" Gerald frowned. "How did you know that?" "Edith mentioned seeing you. She said you were breathing rather hard, as though you had been hurrying." A faint flush rose on Gerald's cheeks. "I may have walked quickly. I was thinking about the conversation I'd had with my uncle the night before. It was emotional. He spoke of making amends for past mistakes. He said he had decided something important and would tell me after he finished his accounts that morning." "After 10 minutes?" Miss Marple asked softly. Gerald looked startled. He didn't say exactly, but yes, he mentioned he needed a few minutes alone to finalize his thoughts. Miss Marple regarded him with kind, steady eyes. "Young people are often impatient, Mr. Abercrombie, but sometimes waiting those extra minutes can prevent a lifetime of regret." She left him looking troubled and made her way to the garden, where Tom Briggs was raking leaves into a neat pile. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke from a small bonfire he had lit earlier. "Good morning, Tom. May I sit here for a moment? See, my old legs are not what they used to be." Tom brought her a wooden garden chair and sat on an upturned bucket nearby. He seemed glad of the company. "Miss Marple, I've been thinking a lot about that morning." The colonel raised his hand. "Like I told you, it wasn't a wave exactly. It looked more like he was saying no to someone or pushing something away, but there was no one else in the room that I could see." Miss Marple leaned forward. "And you are quite sure of the time?" "The church clock struck the quarter just after I moved away from the window, so it must have been around 9:12 or 9:13 when I saw him raise his hand." 9:12. Mrs. Price had left the room at 9. She returned at 9:10, and that left a window of only 2 or 3 minutes when something could have happened after she left, but before the colonel wrote his last line. Miss Marple felt a small thrill of understanding. The timing was becoming clearer. She spent the rest of the morning walking slowly around the house, noting the positions of doors, windows, and paths. There was a small conservatory attached to the side of the study, with a door that opened into the garden. The glass was old, and one pane near the bottom had a crack. From there, it might be possible for someone nimble to slip in and out without using the main door. By lunchtime, she returned to her cottage, her mind full. She prepared a simple meal of soup and bread, then sat by the fire with her knitting. The lavender shawl was nearly finished now. Only a few more rows remained, when Dolly Bantry dropped in for afternoon tea, full of village gossip. "Jane, everyone is saying Gerald must have done it because he inherits everything, but I spoke to Griselda, and she thinks it might be the housekeeper. Mrs. Price has been with him for years. She could have known where the digitalis was kept." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "It is rarely the most obvious person, Dolly. In this case, I believe the murderer is someone who felt deeply wronged or deeply threatened by whatever decision the colonel was about to make in those 10 minutes. The poison was digitalis, something that could be prepared from garden plants. Someone who knew the garden well might have had access." "Tom Briggs?" Dolly asked. "Perhaps. Or someone who could move through the garden without being noticed." As evening fell, Miss Marple sat alone, and watching the firelight play on the walls. She thought of the colonel, sitting at his desk with the weight of past sins and future decisions pressing upon him. She thought of Gerald's ambition, Mrs. Price's quiet loyalty, Edith's fear, and Tom's gratitude mixed with old resentment. One of them had entered that study, or reached into it, in those 10 short minutes. One of them had offered the colonel something to drink, or placed something on his desk, and then left him to die while they returned to their ordinary tasks. The human heart could hold so much: love, hate, fear, and the desperate need to protect a secret. In St. Mary Mead, where life moved in gentle, predictable rhythms, The extraordinary had happened in the most ordinary way. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, the needles clicking steadily. "Too soon," she whispered to the quiet room. "Soon the pattern will be complete." Tuesday morning dawned with a thin mist that clung to the fields and turned the spire of St. Mary Mead's church into a ghostly finger pointing toward heaven. Miss Marple had slept little, her mind turning restlessly over the fragments she had gathered. By 9 o'clock she was once more at Old Priory House, this time carrying a small basket of fresh eggs from her own hens as a pretext for her visit. Mrs. Price welcomed her gratefully. "You're a kind soul, Miss Marple. The house feels so empty now. Mr. Gerald has gone into much Benham to see the solicitor about the will. Edith is upstairs packing some of the Colonel's clothes for charity, and Tom is burning leaves at the bottom of the garden." Miss Marple set the eggs on the kitchen table. Then perhaps we might sit together for a few minutes, my dear. These tragedies leave such a mark on those who remain. You served the Colonel faithfully for many years. It must feel like losing a part of your own life." The housekeeper's eyes filled with sudden tears. She brushed them away with the corner of her apron. "He wasn't an easy man, but he was honest. When my husband died and left me with debts, the Colonel paid them without a word of reproach. Said a good servant was worth more than gold. I would have done anything for him." "Anything?" Miss Marple asked gently, her voice full of understanding rather than accusation. Mrs. Price looked up sharply, then sighed. "You see a great deal, don't you?" "Yes, anything, but not murder. Never that. Though I knew he was troubled these last weeks. Now that letter from the solicitors, it was about an old matter from Malaya. Something to do with his former partner, Mr. Harrington. There was talk of missing funds, and the Colonel feared it might come out after his death. He said he wanted to set things right before it was too late." Miss Marple nodded slowly. 10 minutes to decide, she murmured. Perhaps he was deciding whether to confess something in his will or to destroy certain papers. A heavy burden for an old man. They were interrupted by Edith, who came down the back stairs carrying a bundle of suits. The girl's face was drawn and pale, her eyes red from crying. "Miss Marple," she said in a small voice, "I found something in the Colonel's dressing-gown pocket when I was sorting the clothes. The police searched everything, but this was tucked deep in the lining." She held out a small folded piece of paper. Miss Marple took it carefully. In the Colonel's handwriting were the words, "If anything happens to me, look in the third drawer of the desk. The truth is there." 10 minutes was not enough. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she kept her expression calm and kind. "How very significant. You did right to bring this to me, Edith. May we look in the drawer now?" The three women went together to the study. The third drawer of the big mahogany desk was locked, but Mrs. Price produced her master key. Inside lay a thin bundle of old letters tied with faded ribbon and a single sheet of fresh notepaper. On it, the Colonel had begun a new will, dated the morning of his death. It left the bulk of his estate not to Gerald, but to a trust for making restitution to the family of my late partner, James Harrington, whose death I may have hastened through my own greed and silence. A smaller legacy was left to Mrs. Price, and a cottage and savings to Tom Briggs for his honest work and second chance. Miss Marple read the document twice, her gentle face grave. So this was the decision he was weighing, to confess at last, even from beyond the grave. 10 minutes to decide whether to protect his name or his conscience. Mrs. Price sank into a chair, her hands shaking. "He never told me the full story, only that he had done something in Malaya he regretted bitterly. Mr. Harrington died of a fever, but there were rumors the Colonel had withheld medicine or funds. I think Gerald knew something about it. They argued that night." Edith twisted her apron. "And Tom? He once told me the Colonel had promised to help his sick mother if he stayed on. But if the will changed, perhaps Tom feared losing everything." Miss Marple folded the paper carefully. "Human motives are rarely simple, my dears. Greed, fear, loyalty, shame, they all tangled together like knitting wool. Someone in this house could not bear the thought of the Colonel's confession becoming public. Someone who stood to lose not only money, but reputation or security. She asked to be left alone in the study for a few minutes. Sitting in the leather chair where the Colonel had died, she closed her eyes and tried to reconstruct those 10 minutes. 9 o'clock. Mrs. Price leaves the tray and closes the door. The Colonel is alone, writing. He begins the new will on 9:02 or 9:03. Someone enters, perhaps through the conservatory door or by using a duplicate key. They speak urgently. The Colonel raises his hand in protest, as Tom saw from the window. A glass of water is offered, or a few drops are added to the tea when the Colonel's back is turned for a moment. Digitalis, prepared from the foxgloves in the border. Easy for someone who knew the garden. The visitor leaves quickly, locking the door from the outside with a second key, then slipping the original key into the Colonel's pocket later. No, that was impossible if the door was locked when Mrs. Price returned. Miss Marple's eyes opened. The bolt had not been shot. The door had been locked with the key, but perhaps the murderer had never entered the room at all. She rose and examined the conservatory door again. It was stiff but unlocked. From the conservatory, one could reach the study window. A long, thin instrument, perhaps a gardener's cane or a fishing rod, could have been used to push something onto the desk or to drop poison into the tea from outside. But Digitalis needed to be ingested. Unless... Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the gravel. Tom Briggs appeared at the study window, his face tense. "Miss Marple, I saw you come in. Is everything all right?" "I heard voices." Miss Marple beckoned him inside. "Come in, Tom. I think it is time we spoke plainly. You were fond of the Colonel. He gave you a second chance. Yet on that morning you looked angry when you saw him through the window. Why?" Tom's strong hands clenched. "Because I overheard part of the argument the night before. Mr. Gerald was pressing him to keep the old will. Said the Harrington business was best left buried. The Colonel said he had only 10 minutes left in his life to do what was right. I thought Gerald might try to stop him. I was worried. That's why I looked in. When I saw the Colonel raise his hand, I thought he was arguing with Gerald inside the room. But no one was there. No one visible," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Yet someone acted in those 10 minutes. Someone who knew the Colonel's routines, who could move through the garden unnoticed, who had access to Digitalis from the foxgloves, and who feared losing the security the Colonel had promised." Tom's face paled. "You think it was me?" "I think it was someone who loved the Colonel in their own way, but loved their own future more," Miss Marple said, and her voice full of sorrow rather than blame. "A very human failing. We all want to protect what we have." She sent Tom back to his work and returned to her cottage, the new will and the note safe in her handbag. The pattern was almost complete. The murderer had not needed to enter the room fully. A few drops of poison introduced through the partly open window while the Colonel was distracted by writing. A quick movement from the terrace or conservatory. Then the murderer had slipped away, leaving the ordinary morning to continue. Tea cooling, gardener clipping, maid making beds, while the Colonel realized too late what had happened and wrote his final poignant line. That evening, Inspector Slack came again, this time at Miss Marple's invitation. She showed him the new will and the note. Slack's face grew grim as he read. "So the motive was to prevent this confession and keep the original inheritance," he said. "Gerald Abercrombie had the most to lose. Or someone who depended on Gerald's future generosity," Miss Marple added softly. "But the method, I believe I know how it was done. It required someone familiar with the garden and with steady hands." She explained her theory of the window and the quick administration of poison. Slack listened, at first skeptical, then impressed despite himself. "You have a remarkable mind, Miss Marple," he admitted grudgingly, "but we still need proof." "Proof will come," she said quietly, when we confront the human heart that could not wait those 10 minutes. As night settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by her fire once more. The lavender shawl was finished. She folded it carefully, thinking of the baby it was meant for and of how life continued even after tragedy. One more piece remained. One final conversation would reveal the truth hidden in plain sight, the truth that everyone had noticed except for those crucial 10 minutes before anyone noticed the Colonel was dying. Wednesday evening found the drawing room at Old Priory House filled with an uneasy quiet. A fire burned low in the grate, casting long shadows across the heavy furniture. Miss Marple had requested a small gathering, just the household and a few friends. She had said gently to Mrs. Price. Inspector Slack stood near the door, his expression official but curious. Dr. Haydock sat in a corner chair, watching with quiet interest. Dolly Bantry and the vicar had also been invited, lending an air of ordinary village support. Gerald Abercrombie paced restlessly by the window. Mrs. Price sat upright on the sofa, her hands folded tightly. Edith perched on the edge of a straight chair, twisting her handkerchief. Tom Briggs stood awkwardly near the fireplace, cap in hand, looking as though he would rather be anywhere else in the world. Miss Marple occupied the central armchair, her lavender shawl draped over her lap like a banner of gentle authority. She looked at each face in turn with kind, penetrating blue eyes. "Thank you all for coming," she began in her soft, clear voice. "These past days have been painful for everyone. A good man died in this house in the middle of his ordinary morning routine. Colonel Abercrombie was found dead exactly 10 minutes after his housekeeper brought him his tea. The door was locked, the key in his pocket. No one claims to have seen or heard anything unusual. Yet murder was done, quietly, cleverly, and in plain sight of the everyday life that continued around him." She paused, letting the words settle. The key to this mystery lies not in dramatic entrances or secret passages, but in those 10 ordinary minutes, in what people expected to see, and in the one small thing they failed to notice. Gerald stopped pacing. "If you know something, Miss Marple, speak plainly. Are you accusing me?" "Not yet, Mr. Abercrombie," she replied calmly. "Let us look at the facts together. Colonel Abercrombie was writing a new will that morning, the one Edith found in his dressing gown. In it, he planned to leave most of his fortune to make restitution for an old wrong committed in Malaya against his former partner's family. And he wrote 10 minutes to decide in his ledger. He was weighing his conscience against his reputation and his family's expectations." She turned to Mrs. Price. "You knew he was troubled, my dear. You had served him loyally for years. You would have done almost anything to protect him, or to protect the life you had built here." Mrs. Price's face paled, but she met Miss Marple's gaze steadily. "I did not kill him." "I know you did not," Miss Marple said kindly. "Your hands trembled when you spoke of him, but they trembled from grief, not guilt. You had no reason to fear the new will. In fact, it left you a generous legacy." Her eyes moved to Edith. "You were frightened, my child. You heard raised voices and saw Mr. Gerald hurrying up the back stairs, but your fear was for yourself, for losing your position if the household changed. So you did not administer poison." Edith gave a small, relieved sob. Miss Marple continued. "Tom Briggs, you looked angry when you saw the Colonel through the window. You had been given a second chance and feared losing the security the Colonel had promised. Yet your anger came from worry, not hatred. You raised no hand against him." Tom nodded slowly, his honest face relaxing a fraction. "Then we come to you, Mr. Gerald Abercrombie," Miss Marple said, her voice still gentle, but now edged with steel. "You stood to lose the greatest inheritance. Your uncle hinted he would leave you the house and fortune, but on that last night he spoke of making amends. You went out to the terrace for a smoke at approximately 9:10. You looked up at the study window. From the terrace, with the curtains half drawn, you could see your uncle clearly at his desk." Gerald's hands clenched. "I did nothing but smoke a cigarette." Exactly, said Miss Marple. You did nothing inside the room, but you did something from outside. The conservatory door was unlocked. From there, or from the narrow gap in the yew hedge you could reach while pretending to stroll, it was possible to use a long, thin tool, your walking stick perhaps, or one of the Colonel's own Malayan canes that stood in the hall, to reach through the partly open window. She paused, her eyes sad. Digitalis can be extracted from foxgloves in the border, a few drops in a small phial. While the Colonel was bent over his ledger, writing his decision to confess, you introduced the poison into his tea or into the glass of water on his desk. It required only a moment. Then you withdrew, and locking the door from the outside with the spare key that Mrs. Price kept on her ring, but which you had quietly taken earlier that morning from the kitchen drawer while she was busy. You slipped the original key into your uncle's pocket when you briefly entered the study later, after Mrs. Price had discovered the body and the room was in confusion. No one noticed in the shock of the moment. The bolt was never shot because you never needed to bolt it from inside. Gerald's face had gone white. This is monstrous. You have no proof. Miss Marple sighed softly, full of genuine regret. I have the new will. I have the note saying 10 minutes was not enough. And I have the testimony of the timing. Tom saw the Colonel raise his hand in protest at 9:12, after Mrs. Price had left, but while you were still on the terrace. The Colonel realized what was happening. He tried to signal for help, but the poison was already working. He managed to write those last words before collapsing. 10 minutes to decide his legacy. And you could not bear to let him decide against you. A heavy silence fell. Gerald opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time, the smooth charm cracked, revealing the frightened, ambitious young man beneath. I only wanted what was promised, he whispered. He owed the family. The Malayan business was old history. No one needed to know. When he said he was changing everything, I panicked. I thought if he died quickly, the old will would stand. I didn't think it would work so fast. Inspector Slack stepped forward. Gerald Abercrombie, I'm arresting you for the murder of Colonel Lucius Abercrombie. You do not have to say anything, but anything you do say may be given in evidence. Gerald did not resist. As he was led away, he looked back once at Miss Marple with something like bewilderment. How did an old lady in a village see what no one else did? Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. Because I have lived long enough to know that murder is rarely about grand schemes, my dear. It is usually about small human weaknesses. Greed, fear, the inability to wait when waiting might bring justice or forgiveness. People notice everything in their daily routine, except the one moment when someone steps outside that routine for just 10 minutes. Later, when the others had gone and only Dr. Haydock and Dolly Bantry remained, Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire at her own cottage. Dolly shook her head in wonder. Jane, you're quite extraordinary, the way you put it all together from knitting and village gossip. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Not extraordinary, my dear, only observant. We all live in patterns. Morning tea, gardening, making beds, smoking on the terrace. The murderer counted on those patterns to hide the crime. But patterns have gaps. And in the gap of those 10 minutes, a man's life ended and his conscience tried to speak one last time. Dr. Haydock rose to leave. You have a kind heart, Jane, even when you uncover ugly truths. I try to, she said softly. Because behind every murderer, there is a human being who was once a child, who once hoped, who once felt love or fear too strongly. It is the tragedy of it all that moves me most. When she was alone, Miss Marple picked up the finished lavender shawl and held it to the firelight. And life in St. Mary Mead would return to its gentle rhythm. The leaves would fall, the church bells would ring, and new babies would be born. But for a little while, the village had been reminded that even the quietest places hold deep currents of human emotion, love, regret, ambition, and the terrible temptation to take justice into one's own hands. She folded the shawl carefully and placed it in her basket. 10 minutes, she murmured to the empty room. Such a very short time, and yet long enough to destroy a life or to save a soul. Outside, the night wind whispered through the yew hedges of Old Priory House, carrying away the last echoes of a mystery that had begun and ended in the ordinary heartbeat of a village morning, 10 minutes before anyone noticed. In the weeks that followed, St. Mary Mead returned to its peaceful rhythm. And the yew hedges were trimmed once more, morning tea was served at 9, and Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily by her window. Yet every now and then, when the church clock struck the 9:15, villagers would glance toward Old Priory House and remember how 10 ordinary minutes had changed everything. Miss Marple folded the lavender shawl and smiled gently. "We notice so much," she murmured, "yet so often miss the one small thing that truly matters. The human heart beating behind the silence." And in that quiet wisdom, the mystery of those fatal 10 minutes found its final, gentle rest.